we have the pleasure of welcoming Richard Stengel. He was the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs from 2013 to 2016. Before working for the State Department, he was the editor of Time for 7 years, from 2006 to 2013. From 1992 to 94, he collaborated with Nelson Mandela on the South African leader's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. Stengel later wrote Mandela's Way, a New York Times bestseller, on his experience working with Mandela. He is an MSNBC political analyst, and his most recent book is Information Wars: How We Lost the Global Battle Against Disinformation and What We Can Do About It. Please join me in unmuting for a moment and welcoming with your applause, Richard Stengel. Hi, Richard.
Hi, everybody. Fantastic to be here.
Wonderful. Mr. Stengel, thank you so much. And Sophie, we can just kill the slides for a moment and focus on Mr. Stengel. Thank you so much. Well, we are delighted to have you with us today, and I feel that we have a lot to learn from you, so I'm going to throw some questions out there, and then, as I said to the group, at about 12:45, I will open it up for questions from all of you. Mr. Stengel, we've been discussing two main topics throughout the last few months: cultural diplomacy, which we've come to define as the exchange of ideas, art, and aspects of culture in order to foster mutual understanding, and soft power, which we've looked at as the ability to persuade others through attraction rather than hard power. When we've talked about these concepts, we've seen many references, especially through cultural diplomacy, to public diplomacy. I'm wondering if you could tell us, in your words, how do you define public diplomacy, and what would you say are the key delineations between cultural diplomacy, public diplomacy, and soft power?
Thank you, Carla. It's great to be here. It's great to see you all. I looked at some of your bios in the chat, and it's really an impressive group, wide-ranging interests, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you. As I told Carla when she asked me to do this, I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to cultural diplomacy, and we'll talk about that. I'm not against it, but it's kind of like chicken soup. It doesn't hurt, but it might be good. And also, I want to also talk more broadly about public diplomacy, and I'll get into answering the question, because public diplomacy, as a lot of you know, is not something that's well defined. I understand that Joe Nye spoke to you guys earlier, and Joe came up with that great phrase, soft power. And I put public diplomacy under this idea of soft power. It's things that governments can do to influence foreign publics, as they would say in the State Department, without shooting at them. The technical definition of public diplomacy, I think, at the State Department is informing and influencing foreign publics. And one of the things about government, and a lot of you have been in government, I hope a lot of you consider going into government. I think national service and public service is an important thing to do. But government tends to have pretentious, opaque names for very simple things. Public diplomacy is hard to define because even the word diplomacy is hard to define. The much simpler way of talking about it is the way you talk about it in the private sector. It's marketing, it's public relations, it's communications. That's what public diplomacy is. But of course, nobody at the State Department wants to say, I'm the Undersecretary of Marketing or Public Relations. We don't like doing that. So we call it something fancy. So at the same time, I also think one of the problems with the way public diplomacy is practiced, and again, within the State Department, there are different cones that foreign service officers have, and public diplomacy is one of the cones. Politics is another, economics is another, but public diplomacy is sort of, to quote Rodney Dangerfield, who you're all too young to remember, who was the comedian who used to say, I don't get no respect. Public diplomacy was the I don't get no respect cone. And part of it is that it's poorly defined, and part of it is that it doesn't use the things that the private sector does. I used to joke that I was the chief marketing officer for Brand USA. people at the State Department hated that. Now, the other reason it's not true is because chief marketing officers know about 1,000 times more about their audience than anybody at the State Department does. Nobody at the State Department understands who their audience is. I mean, I saw Carla talking like, is it big? Is it small? Were they here? Are they there? I remember when I went in and I first started at the State Department and I said, let me see all the brand segmentation studies about all the public diplomacy that we do. You know, I got a bunch of blank looks. Nobody knew what a brand segmentation study was. You know, if you've been to business school, that's marketing 101. That's something that people didn't know about. They didn't seem to care about. There was no analysis of what the audience is. And if you don't know who your audience is, and if you don't know who you're trying to reach, the message doesn't really matter. So, that's, you're getting my skepticism about public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. And I have to say, I mean, because I saw the beautiful pictures of Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, and I know you were talking about jazz diplomacy, and it was indeed a great thing in its time. And the other thing that you haven't talked about is it wasn't about music. It was about race relations and civil rights. That was the beginning of the civil rights era. The fact that all of these jazz ambassadors were Black men and women is not a coincidence. The fact that the one of the deepest criticisms that the Soviet Union would make of America is, you're a hypocrite. You don't have freedom in your own country. It was 5 years after Brown versus Board of Education, where schools were desegregated. So this was a public diplomacy effort, but call it PR, call it marketing, to show people around the world that, you know, America did try to live up to its ideals, and that these were true ambassadors for American culture, but also for the American idea of equal rights and freedom, which we were, you know, even just then beginning to address. So what I'd add is that that's, as wonderful as it was, that's an absolute anachronism today. Because the other point about it was an era of scarcity, of information, of culture. You couldn't listen to jazz in Budapest or Moscow. You just couldn't do it. And now it's like, well, yeah, I've got Spotify and I have my Spotify app and I'm listening to jazz in Red Square. So there is no era of scarcity. In fact, what cultural diplomacy now has to do is reckon with an era of overabundance of everything. So that's my skeptical introduction. And I hope I haven't dissuaded all of you.
No, quite the contrary, Mr. Stengel. This is really great for us to hear for a number of reasons. Thank you for mentioning what you did about the Jazz Ambassadors program. We did kind of a deep dive on that in the fall, in particular as to how it dove into race relations. And obviously Louis Armstrong actually, you know, there were times he said, I'm not going until certain things get fixed here in our country. And I kind of can't help but return to this idea of, chief marketing officer for Team USA. I think that's really one way to put it that encapsulates this. Before I move to the next question, though, I want to come back at some point on what you said about brand segmentation study. Because one of the things I know that our group is so devoted to is how can we translate some of the metrics from the business sector, from the communications and marketing sector, to really be able to quantify performance measurement in the arts. So perhaps if you see fit, maybe later we can touch on that in some way, or if there are examples. I know the group would really love to see some of that. But just diving in a little bit more of your firsthand experience, you served as President Obama's Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. I believe you are the longest serving Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. So tell us, how does an administration go about creating a public diplomacy strategy? I'm assuming that there are goals like what we just looked at with the jazz ambassadors, and that those goals would be tied to supporting public policy. But how exactly do you go about that without it seeming as a sort of propaganda tool, let's say, to use the taboo term? What do you think?
Yes, I'll get to that. So yes, it's a good question. And the very short answer is that I don't think any administration has ever actually come into office with a public diplomacy strategy, because it's not the first thing that they think about. It's not even the 100th thing that they think about. By the way, that line about being the longest serving undersecretary for public diplomacy in American history, I started saying that as a joke because there had never been, until I was in office, an undersecretary for public diplomacy who had served for longer than a year and a half. It's a job since its creation that has spent as much time unfilled as it has filled. So we're a year and a quarter into the Biden administration. There's no nominee yet for undersecretary for public diplomacy and public affairs. Not even, much less someone confirmed. So
thank you for bringing that up. Yes, thank you.
So it's like, that's so if you're asking, do people think about it? The short answer is no. They don't even think about a darn nominee for the job, although I'm sure they're thinking about that. So no administration comes in thinking about public diplomacy because, Carla, as you suggest, and this is my view, the point of public diplomacy is to support policy. And the best public diplomacy is good policy. The worst public diplomacy is bad policy. When things happen, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the AUKUS agreement, I mean, I'm thinking of things that are not good public diplomacy. That does more than anything you can ever do in public diplomacy to kind of, put lipstick on a pig, as the old expression goes. You can't do that. And when you have a policy success and you do something strong, and I would argue, for example, that what the administration is doing around Ukraine is very strong, no public diplomacy can enhance that. The policy itself speaks volumes. So to me, having a public diplomacy strategy is about how to best support policy and how to integrate public diplomacy policy with marketing. One of the great American public diplomats is Edward R. Murrah, who's a longtime journalist, CBS News journalist, who became the first head of the US Information Agency, which was a kind of precursor to public diplomacy. And he famously said to policymakers, if you don't have me in on the takeoff, don't call me in for the landing. And by that he meant, it's like when people wanted public diplomacy, it was like when things were failing. It's like, how do you rescue us? Well, you didn't call me and plan it out. I could have told you how to avoid this. So I always used to preach that too. Anybody in public diplomacy preaches that, but and been for good reasons, people don't pay attention to it in the sense that, policymakers think about policy. And I would argue that policymakers in the 21st century, and the best ones, also think about the public diplomacy of policy. And I think, again, going back to the Ukraine, one of the lessons that I think the administration has learned from that period in 2014, when Russia first annexed Crimea, is like, whoa, we need to get out in front of this. That's better public diplomacy than kind of throwing up our arms and saying, we don't know who those little green men are in Crimea. Well, we did. So, and then the P word, propaganda. I've been criticized because I also jokingly, I hope someone doesn't take it out of context, jokingly referred to myself as the chief propagandist for the US, which is what people used to refer to that undersecretary job. The thing about, and propaganda is such a negative term, but I'll use another term that was once negative a long, long time ago: rhetoric. People in ancient Greece would sometimes criticize rhetoric. And Plato said, hey, dude, he didn't say dude, hey, folks, rhetoric is neutral. You can use it in favor of something positive and wonderful, or you can use it in favor of something nefarious and evil. But rhetoric itself is neutral. Propaganda in some ways is similar. It's about harnessing information, hopefully true information, with a particular point of view. You could argue the jazz ambassadors was a form of propaganda. I'd argue it was a very positive form, but I don't want to. It's probably better not even to talk about it. But it's even that term that the State Department uses for public diplomacy to influence foreign
hearts and minds. Yes.
Yes. I mean, that's, I don't know. That's a pretty darn good definition of propaganda. So
I'm glad you brought that up. No, it's really important for us, I think, to hear I don't want to say skepticism, but the analysis that you're offering here, because so often, particularly in the arts and in the arts sector, it can get to be very much about the feelings, right? And that's great. But when we look at what's happening right now with COVID, certainly some of the foreign affairs challenges, and furthermore, just the economics of all of this, where is the ROI? How do we quantify all of that? And I think that's what you're, forcing us to examine. Before I go to the next question, tangentially to what you're talking about here, you brought up, the situation right now in the Ukraine. So if you could just offer maybe a few thoughts on how do you think the US government is doing regarding this public diplomacy strategy with the Ukraine? Are they handling it well? What would you do differently?
So yes, thanks for bringing that up. And Carla mentioned my book, Information Wars, which was about kind of my encounters with ISIS propaganda, Russian disinformation, both of which were new to me when I went into the State Department, even after I'd been my whole career as a journalist and 7 years as editor of Time. And I write a lot about it. And disinformation is a difficult problem, which we can talk about later. But I think one of the things the administration is doing now is that, and folks like Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan were in office when Russia actually invaded Ukraine in 2014 by annexing Crimea, did it kind of surreptitiously, using this term that Russians call active measures, which is hybrid warfare. And I think there were lessons that everybody learned from that. And I think you're seeing the result of those lessons now, which is that the State Department and the White House is trying to get out in front of Russian disinformation, of false flags. One of the things you learn about in the counter disinformation era is you try to inoculate people against disinformation, and you inoculate them against it by giving it to them beforehand and saying, hey, the Russians are going to do this. And I think they've been very aggressive in that regard, and I think smart. And so I hope to God there is no actual full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I spent a lot of time in Ukraine when I was in the administration. It's an incredibly important country. We can talk about that, but that's a relatively short answer to that question.
No, thank you. Thank you. That's very insightful, and sort of the inoculation certainly goes with the vaccine theme that we've seen in the last couple of years as an important strategy. Sort of touching on this disinformation period, this era that we're in now, you've also mentioned this idea of this overabundance, right, that we're up against in cultural diplomacy and many other ways. Prior to serving as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, you were the editor of Time magazine. So given your unique background and experience, how would you advise an administration or a government to avoid these threats of disinformation? You've obviously, spoken to this inoculation strategy, but it seems especially dangerous at a time when really any individual has the power of social media, the vitality of it, and this can spread disinformation in a way that just can so quickly become a threat to democracy. Can you speak a little bit to that, please?
Yes. I did write a whole book about disinformation. I've continued to be involved in studying disinformation, and I think when I was doing PR for the book, and it was a Zoom thing, sort of like this, and someone said to me, "Mr. Stengel, do you think the percentage of disinformation related to information is different now than any time in history?" And of course, all of us go, yeah, of course it is. There's way more of it. And I spent a lot of time thinking about it. There's also a lot more information. Eric Schmidt said that some years ago that there's more information created every 2 days now than the history of all information from the beginning of civilization to 2003. Now, and that's a 7 or 8 year old quote. So there's exponentially more information, good information, factual information. It's never been easier to get actual factual information now than any time in human history. I remember like 20 years ago, like one day I used to study in England, like the whole British Museum library, you could access it through a smartphone. It's one of the greatest things in the history of civilization. So I'm not so sure there's more disinformation. The difference is it's easier to access. And people who want to access it can access it, and they access it in abundance. You know, I'm a big believer in cognitive, you know, the study of cognitive biases, confirmation biases, that we seek out information that we agree with. We reject information that we don't. If you're likely to believe in conspiracy theories, that's what you're going to do. Look for them. But by the way, when I was growing up, if you wanted to find a conspiracy theory, if you wanted to read about the, you know, a conspiracy theory about the JFK assassination, I don't even know where you'd go. The public library wouldn't have those books. Newsstands wouldn't have it. There was a scarcity then of disinformation relative to the supply of information. It was hard to access. So yes, it's a big problem for democracies. I mean, you know, the founders, you know, the whole point of the First Amendment, protecting a free press, was the idea that a free press protects democracy, that it holds power to accountability. Governments are formed among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed is arrived through disinformation. It's not real consent. What Jefferson meant about the consent of the governed was that through good information, people can make choices, that they make choices for themselves, they make choices about who they want to lead them. If you get disinformation, those choices are not valid. And I think that's what the disinformationists are trying to do in the most macro way. One of the things I found in government is that it's hard to do anything about it. In government, they love the word counter. And if you're against something, they put the word counter in front of it and they think they're doing something about it. Like, hey, let's start a counterterrorism center. Great. What's it going to do? We're going to counter terrorism. Well, it's just much easier said than done. And countering disinformation is often counterproductive because, again, of another cognitive bias, the backfire effect. When you try to disabuse someone of a deeply held belief that they have, especially perhaps if it's a conspiracy theory, it makes them double down on it. And so that's why you heard so much about this Howard Lakoff truth sandwich, where if you're trying to change someone's mind, you package the misinformation, the disinformation in the center between two slices of truth. We saw with President Trump, who was a one-man band of disinformation, that when people were trying to disabuse people or contradict what he was saying, the fact that you would then repeat what he said, you were increasing the audience that he was reaching. So countering disinformation is difficult and tricky, and still, there's no great answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've really segued into my next question here perfectly, Mr. Stengel. We have so many of our folks here are from other countries. The inconsistencies of the last administration with so many of our longtime allies have left, little doubt, I would say, that the US has lost at least some credibility in the international community due to the actions of the Trump administration. What recommendations would you make to address this issue through public diplomacy? And if I may, do you think that there's a role for cultural diplomacy to play in that?
I do. I mean, this isn't news to anybody, but I mean, we're living at a time globally of a democracy recession. Over the last 15 years, if you look at Freedom House or the Economist Intelligence Unit, I mean, the number of countries that qualify as full-fledged democracies is decreasing, and authoritarian leaders and authoritarian governments are increasing. That's an existential threat, as President Biden called it, and I agree. And one of the very sad things to me about President Trump was that I think he accelerated the trend towards authoritarianism. and everything in American history until then was retarding that trend. And it's a hard problem. There are people around the world that identify with President Trump, the kind of idea of success and winning, whatever that is. So it's not an easy problem either. And to me, not to get on a soapbox, but the learned hand, it was a great judge. The most famous American judge who never became a Supreme Court judge gave a speech in Central Park in New York City during World War II, where he said, constitutions don't matter if people don't believe in them. But then he said, the spirit of liberty is the spirit that's not too sure it's right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit that's not too sure it's right. It's a beautiful line. And authoritarians are never unsure whether they're right. They're always right. Democrats, small d Democrats, we're not sure. We're trying to do the right thing. And we've been wrong many, many times in our history. But that's what, to me, democracy is about. Thinking about what you can do for publics and thinking that you might be wrong. So that's also a hard problem because that doesn't necessarily appeal to people who want a perception of strength and infallibility. Actually, it was another beautiful line that Benjamin Franklin said on the day that they voted to sign the Constitution in Philadelphia. He said, let us all doubt a little of our own infallibility. Authoritarian states don't doubt their infallibility. But I would say that human beings want to make decisions for themselves. They don't want the state to make decisions for themselves. So at any rate, I'm now, preaching. So I'm sorry about that.
No. Quite the contrary. I think that you've raised a point that I find is under discussed, which is this idea of humility and perhaps the very fine line between confidence and humility. I know that most recently, Secretary of State Blinken has been speaking about this, and I have found that very interesting. But from the arts perspective, we often say, particularly in my singing world, that to get on the stage and to be successful in connecting with an audience and the exchange that takes place, you have to have the confidence to sort of bare your soul and sing your heart out, but you also have to have the humility to really be able to expose yourself and exchange. So, I really appreciate those comments, and I certainly hope the Secretary of State Blinken does more along those lines, and I hope you keep talking about that. It's so important. But maybe to switch gears to a very, very different type of leader from the one that we most recently had before Biden. You had the opportunity to work with one of certainly my great heroes, and I'm sure many of the people here. You worked closely with Nelson Mandela, possibly the greatest public diplomat of all time. Could you tell us about some of the key lessons that you took away from that experience?
Yes, I will. And I love talking about Nelson Mandela, and I'm working on something related to him now, but I just want to go back to something you were saying before about humility, which I think is super important. But you also mentioned, and the term has come up before, conversation. And I know I've been skeptical about different aspects of public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy, but to me, the virtue of it and the future of it is conversation. Public diplomacy is lateral, it's horizontal. It is between people. It's not from the top down. It's not a cathedral with people on high preaching down. And social media, in many ways, is the greatest tool of conversation in human history. To me, that's what public diplomats should be using. I tried as much as I could to get everybody on Twitter and Instagram, when I was at the State Department, and another line that nobody liked is when someone asked me who the greatest American public diplomat was, I said Taylor Swift. She has 100 million followers on Twitter. Everybody in the State Department could tweet from now till next year, and it would be not even a fraction of one tweet from Taylor Swift. So, today in cultural diplomacy, it's like, let's not fight against that. We can't fight against it. Let's use that in whatever way we can. Maybe we engage with people in Brazil for a discussion about Taylor Swift. That's good public diplomacy. So at any rate,
if I may just say, Mr. Stengel, I've put your Twitter handle in the chat here, group. I invite you to follow Mr. Stengel on Twitter. You're really wonderful. The way that you sort of, share your thoughts with the world via Twitter. I know I've enjoyed following you since I started. So thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you. So Nelson Mandela was a great public diplomat. And that was in part because he was very self-aware about that in a very good way. I remember, his name might not be familiar to people, Nelson Mandela's closest colleague, the man he was in prison with for 27 years, he loved him, was a man named Walter Sisulu, who was a few years older than Nelson Mandela. And when I was working with Mandela, I also had the privilege of talking with Walter, and who they called Allah on Robben Island because he was so wise. And Walter was then, when he met Mandela, Mandela was like 23 or 24. Walter was maybe 30. And he was the head of the ANC Youth League. And they were trying to bump up against the old-fashioned leadership of the ANC. And I said, what was it like when you met Nelson Mandela? And Walter said, I'll never forget this. He said, we were looking to be a mass organization. And then a mass leader walked into my office. Nelson Mandela was a beautiful man. He was 6'2". He was handsome. As Walter said, he did something that men of that generation didn't do. He smiled. If you go and look at portraits, if you go at Harvard and you look at portrait of every president of Harvard since the 18th century, not one of them is smiling until the 1980s. Men didn't smile, especially in any official capacity. And Nelson Mandela had this beautiful, beatific smile that made the whole world light up. Well, that is also why he was a great public diplomat. But again, the greatest lesson of Nelson Mandela was he used to make a distinction between tactics and principles. He said, you have to have a principle, and then everything else is a tactic. His abiding principle was freedom for his people, democracy, true democracy for white and black in South Africa, to lift up his people to end apartheid. But after that, everything else was a tactic for him. He did lots of very, very difficult things in his life. I mean, people, we remember this kind of smiling grandfatherly Santa Claus figure. Nelson Mandela started Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, which was the violent wing of the ANC to overthrow the white racist government of South Africa through violent means. He was a violent revolutionary. But because to him, he was anti-violence in every way, but his overarching goal was freedom. And if that's what it took to get there, he would do it. So, but he understood marketing, he understood PR, he was way ahead of his time in that way. And that's what I meant about politicians or public policymakers having to understand both. Have to understand the content and the packaging. So he did in a way that was ahead of his time. And that is partially what helped him succeed. And that's partially what helped him, as Walter Sisulu said, to become the head of a mass movement. So, but he was also just an incredibly lovely person to be around. And I have missed him, every day since I left him.
Wow, I am taking notes here as you're speaking, and I feel you've really, in this brief time this morning, you've offered us a masterclass. Thank you so much with just this wide array of experience that you've had. I want to ask one last question, and then in a few minutes, folks, we're going to open it up for questions. I will invite you to raise your hand, and then we'll try to call on people. I'm seeing so many questions in the chat already, which is really great. And again, folks, it's so nice to see the chat going. If we don't get to all of this, it just gives us more to think about and talk about with each other. But before I open it to the chat, one last question, Mr. Stengel. As you look at what lies ahead in terms of the foreign policy challenges, obviously we've touched on Ukraine. Many folks have been talking a lot about US-China relations. what do you think are some of the key challenges we should seek to address? And do you see a way for public diplomacy and, if I may, cultural diplomacy to play a role in addressing any of these challenges? What advice would you give us in terms of how to focus our energy moving forward?
So I'm going to come back to something we touched on earlier, which is this battle between autocracy and democracy, between authoritarian states and republics. And I think that's the greatest crisis of our time. And it's not just internationally between countries, it's within countries. We're seeing that within our own country. We're seeing it in Russia and Brazil and Venezuela and Turkey. We're seeing it all over the planet. And to me, that the issue now, and I think this is a fundamental issue for the Biden administration too, is that people need to see that democracies function for them. That, with all the argument and debate, that nevertheless democracies perform. They have better economies, they have more human rights, people have more agency over their lives. And the argument that that China makes is that, well, no, I mean, democracy doesn't function for you. Illiberal democracies are better than true democracies, and they make a compelling argument. I mean, China has been incredibly successful. They've brought more people out of poverty into the middle class in a shorter time than any time in human history by a huge margin. And they say that's what, I remember once an African foreign minister, when I was traveling in Africa, a delightful man, said to me at the end of our meeting, he said, Mr. Stengel, you come and talk to me about transparency and human rights, and the Chinese come and build me a superhighway. Who am I going to listen to? Well, what's the answer to that? Maybe you guys can figure that out. So it's a very, very big issue. And, public diplomacy can help in the sense that public diplomacy can help talk about the idea that democracies do function better for people, for their citizens. And I think that is true. But I think we have to prove that, or else there's the lights are going to start going out all around the globe. And I think that would be a tragedy. And as I say, these are battles that are not only going on between countries, they're going on within countries. And I think that's the same, this is what my Twitter feed is all about. So, yeah, that's a very big issue. And all the people who are younger than I am on this call and much younger, I hope you'll figure it out.
Well, you've given us a lot of tools to try to do so, Mr. Stengel. Thank you so much. I truly feel, for me, this has been a masterclass, nothing short of it. I've learned a lot in the session. And I know we've got several hands up here. So if I may, I'm going to turn Adele. I saw your hand up first, and then Michael Peltier will go to you next. Adele, are you with us? Can you turn your camera on if possible?
Hear me? Is it okay if I just...
Yes, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to thank our speaker for a wonderful presentation, very insightful, and thank you to you and everybody else for putting this together. Just be interested to hear thoughts on how we think about public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy, not to test our speaker's age, but comparing a unipolar world to a multipolar world, and how that's changed from sort of Cold War to where we are today. And if you could say anything on the role of civil society versus sort of government-led programs during his time as Undersecretary. I mean, one, if you like, competitive advantage that quote-unquote democracies have, nascent, fragile, or otherwise, is often independent or semi-independent civil society, unlike a lot of the autocracies that we compete with. I'm a hybrid. I'm a British Algerian, so from that, within that context. So I'd be interested to hear thoughts on
Thank you.
An excellent question. That unipolar versus multipolar world. I mean, we are living in a multipolar world. That's a good thing. And I think that is a good thing for the idea of democracy. I mean, in that, in the jazz era, when it was more of a unipolar world or a couple of superpowers, that was undemocratic in a very fundamental way. I think having a multipolar world where different areas of influence is a good thing, and people and public diplomats should use that because people, in different areas of the world, they have different priorities, and there's nothing bad about that. Civil society, I'm a gigantic believer and supporter of civil society, and that civil society does public diplomacy better than governments do. I mean, I am a gigantic fan and supporter of going into government, being in government, but people who go into government they tend not to be great singers like Carla, or great poets or great writers. They're people who want to go into government, and they're not necessarily the world's best communicators. People in civil society who can also work with the private sector, to me, is the best way to go. I mean, one of my mottos in government, and I'm sure I stole it from somebody, is you do what you do best and farm out the rest. That's what governments should do, what they do best, and a lot of what they do best is very boring stuff. But that's fine. Governments should do boring stuff. So just do it, and don't and find someone else who can do the other stuff better than you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Stengel. Thank you, Adele, for that question. Let's turn to Michael Peltier, and then after Michael, Katie, we'll hear from you next. Hi, Michael.
Hi, thank you. Ambassador Stengel, it's nice to see you again. I had the great honor of working with you as a public diplomacy officer. Now I'm at the University of Houston. My question is—
Michael, you're the ambassador. As you know, I am not an ambassador.
Well, you certainly did the work, whether you got the title or not.
Well, but you made me look good.
Thank you. It was easy. I want to ask if you could dig in a little deeper on this idea, which I totally support, of the importance of putting out positive news and positive stories and true news, as opposed to the dangers and the difficulties of always being counter, and how sometimes when you're counter something, you're actually reinforcing it. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the challenges of taking that attitude in a bureaucracy, drawing from your experience as undersecretary. And then maybe if I can sneak in a second question, whether you see perhaps cultural diplomacy as preparing the ground for that sort of positive and factual news sharing, opening up the audience's hearts and minds and ears to the true stories and to the positive stories, as opposed to that negative culture of counter information.
No, Michael, thank you for that question. As you know, there aren't easy answers to it. And I'm going to go a little bit far afield. So one of the hallmarks of First Amendment law in the United States is this concept that goes back to the founding, but Justice Holmes used it as the marketplace of ideas. And the idea of the First Amendment was that in the marketplace of ideas, truth drives out falsehood. By the way, we know that's not true. But the other marketplace of the ideas is supply and demand. And to me, truth doesn't necessarily drive out falsehood, but a tsunami of truth drives out a few droplets of falsehood. And to me, the way of countering disinformation is just more good and true information. And I'm actually, later this year, we'll announce something that's a formation of a sort of a good information entity that counters disinformation, in part through the supply of good and factual information. And I think that goes back to what I was saying about a truth sandwich. I mean, I think that is one of the only ways that disinformation doesn't take hold. As to whether cultural diplomacy lays the groundwork for it, it'd be like, yeah, I mean, if Taylor Swift wants to tweet out about the fact-based information that counters disinformation, I think that would be very powerful. That might even be more powerful than Tony Blinken doing it, whom I worship. But so I think some kind of partnership we didn't even really talk about today, but a partnership between government and third parties or private parties and cultural ones is just very, very powerful. I mean, by the way, Barack Obama did a lot of that, yeah, I would always say that's a good thing rather than government doing the singing and dancing itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Stengel. We're going to turn now to Katie's question, and then Hal, I see you. I know you've had your hand up for a little while, so we'll go to you next. Hi, Katie. I think you're muted. Just if you can unmute.
Hi.
There we go.
Yep. And Mr. Stengel, I agree with everything you've said to the core. I mean, literally to the DNA of it. And I just wanted to also, because of today's world, the social media has really completely taken over, as everyone knows here. And it seems to me, general consensus to some extent, because of the social media and because it's started in US and sort of it pushed out individual people that understand how US culture is and projecting that. And the US government has waned away from, the campaigns they've had in the past since, based on the reading we had from the Jazz Age onwards. So they have had, just like you said, there hasn't been an ambassador or minister or anyone assigned by the Biden administration. It seems to me like it's getting less and less and less. And that's quite dangerous, especially in the Middle East. I've worked extensively in the Middle East. And because of this disengagement or disinterest, that creates a void that can lead to extremism. It can lead to a lot of disinformation against the US culture or Americanism. In the fact is, but like, for example, I'm from Iran, I'm Iranian originally, whereas Iran is the opposite. Iranian youth embrace Americanism. And they, despite what the rhetoric of the mullahs, and then whereas Arab countries is the opposite, because this is a complete laissez-faire of US government. And US government needs to, how can US government overcome years of being behind? Sorry for expression.
Great. No, that's a great question. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie. By the way, no one agrees with everything I say, so I know that you're not telling the truth there.
No, I do.
I actually think that, to your last point, and I was able to go to Iran shortly before I went into government, which I loved, but the American soft power America is a soft power hegemon. In some ways, American soft power is unipolar, less so than it used to be. There's a rise of the rest, as Fareed Zakaria put it in a very good phrase. But that's what I meant about let's not compete against ourselves. I mean, American soft power, when I was in Iran, I found it amazing how much people knew about American culture and movies and music. And it's like, I loved that. And it's like would have been nothing I could have ever done at the State Department that could have rivaled that in any way. I don't like the fact that we're not around. I mean, even in our kind of old-fashioned public diplomacy, I agree we should be in Tehran. We should be in all sorts of places. But as I said at the beginning, and again, it's a hard problem. I mean, people, when administrations hit the ground, the first thing to think about is not public diplomacy. So I agree they need to think about it more. And again, it's still, good policy is the best public diplomacy. And our policy in the Middle East is really where our public diplomacy should rally around.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you, Katie, for the question. We've got several hands up and just a few minutes left. Hal, we're going to go to you. And then I'm just going to go straight down in a row after that and just brief questions if possible. So Mehdi, you'll be next, then Burak. Hal, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to make this quicker than I otherwise may have done so. Especially the previous president tended to attack various American news organizations that have international presences like CNN and the New York Times as fake news all the time. And of course, throughout the Cold War and such periods, a lot of people in various countries may have looked to something like the New York Times or American media abroad as maybe something more trustworthy than their own media. I guess my question is, like, has the increasing distrust in the American media among Americans been replicated overseas? So maybe now people in Germany, when they hear about what the New York Times says, are they like less willing to trust it? If that's happening, is that like a dangerous trend for U.S. Soft power overseas? I guess how would that be combated? And also, is that possibly placing journalists themselves at risk who operate in these countries?
Great question, Hal. Thank you.
Yes, excellent question. And I agree with the thrust of it. I mean, no American president has ever liked the press or the press coverage that he has gotten. But no American president has ever questioned the role of the fourth estate, the role of the press in a democracy, and why it is so essential. Donald Trump did. That's why he's an authoritarian figure. He would happily do away with the entire press except for the press that is laudatory towards him. And that idea that he helped promulgate, didn't create it, fake news, is a really pernicious term and idea. And it has become the byword of authoritarians for anything they don't like that's written about them is called fake news. One of the things to me that I think is part of America's most powerful public diplomacy and soft power is the amount of criticism that presidents and public leaders get in the American press. You know, when people come to America, they're always surprised by it. I mean, one of my predecessors in the job told me the story of how there's an exchange program when she was undersecretary, and she got an emergency call from this Russian teenager that he had to go, that he had to, that he was going to, oh yeah, he had to go home. And she finally got in touch with him and was able to talk to him. And she said, why do you have to go home? And she said, well, because my family is yelling at the president on TV every day, and I know they're going to get arrested soon, so I need to get out of here. So it's like, well, that's, you know, you can yell at the president in America. You can, there's an adversarial press relationship. That's part of Americans' public diplomacy. People around the world see the stuff that we say about ourselves. I remember actually, speaking of you know, the other form of this, I remember once having one of my first meetings with a group of Chinese diplomats at the State Department. And, you know, you've heard me today, so obviously, you know, I make jokes. And at the beginning of the meeting, I made a joke about House of Cards. Well, we practically couldn't start the meeting because the Chinese diplomats were all laughing so hard. They'd all watched House of Cards. They'd watched every episode of it. And someone joked, you know, they thought it was a documentary. But the larger point is, like, what is a country that can make that kind of content about itself and have it be popular and still function and have people still respect those institutions? Like, that's a country I want to live in. You can't make House of Cards in Beijing or any authoritarian state. So, but the attacks on the press are dangerous. You know, what they're trying to do is make journalism into a crime. And that's also an existential challenge, and that's a subset of the autocracy versus democracy challenge.
Thank you so much. We are running really short on time here, and obviously we're all learning so much from Mr. Stengel. Thank you. I don't want to keep you over, but what I'm going to do is really just 10 seconds for the 5 that we have left. Could you just quickly say a question? I'll take all of you consecutively, and then we'll leave it to sort of last remarks for Mr. Stengel. So just very, very briefly here, Mendy, Burak, Leon, Kent, Sydney, and Ilya. Go ahead, Mendy.
I don't want to ask my question. I just want to tell, you know, Ambassador Stengel that I am a believer in morality and ethics in politics and in foreign policy. And whenever he talks, it reminds me, yes, there is a room for that. And I want to thank him for that. I don't ask my question because my question is not that important. Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Burak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stengel, for the seminar. I have a quick question regarding how do you see the combination of soft and hard power in preventing war? More precisely, how to use sticks and carrots if you look to the Ukrainian crisis right now.
Great. Great. Thank you, Burak. Leigh and Kent, we'll hear from you, Sydney and Ilya, and then we'll give the last words.
How do you feel about possible restoration of the fairness doctrine at the FCC? Do you think that would help mitigate against the vast amount of disinformation? And should we go back to the fairness doctrine?
Great question. Thank you, guys. Sydney?
Hello, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Mr. Stengel and everyone for making this possible. I'm a performing artist and work as a cultural policy consultant. And so I've been wondering your opinion on this. Throughout the arts sector, the performance and arts funding spheres, the post-George Floyd era, of course, has brought some fundamental reassessments of equity in programming and in really every other aspect of the industry. In your tenure with the Obama administration, did you ever, in your role, assess or engage organizations with the intent of addressing disparities between their, racial, gender, or representational inequities with the purpose or hope of aligning them with the State Department's strategic communication strategy? And would you consider such a dynamic between state and private sector an overreach, or, is there a fixed point where you might draw the line in?
That's a great question. Thank you, Sydney. And I'm sorry to cut it short here. We're a little over. Thank you. Ilya, if you could ask your question very briefly, and it's obviously going to be impossible for Mr. Stengel to answer all these, but we'll just give him the last word to wrap up. Go ahead, Ilya.
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm a Harvard Kennedy student, and I was a journalist in Kiev Post since 2014. So I have two questions. One is if you can provide a little bit more regarding the distinction between soft power and the actual politicians, because oftentimes when I was in Ukraine or speaking with Russians, the idea was that, well, we believe in the soft power, but we don't believe the politicians. So then the second question is, in terms of how social media's sort of pernicious side is evolving in terms where people value the opinion of, say, a vlogger much more than sort of the traditional media. Those are my two questions.
Richard, feel free to just answer one of them. I know we're over and I don't want to keep you. We'll sort of track these and we can start the meeting next time with some of this. But if you have any last comments or any thoughts to share, much appreciated.
Sure. Thank you, Carla. Thank you again for having me. I have written down those questions. I'll just do a little bit of a drive-by. I'm happy to talk with you afterwards about, I'm happy to stay engaged with people if people want to stay engaged, and we'll figure that out. The two questions sort of touch on soft power and hard power. It's not an easy distinction. I was much more involved in the harder end of soft power when I was at the State Department countering disinformation. I don't know the answer to that. The fairness doctrine question, which I get asked a lot, has a much longer answer. To me, the reform is reforming Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act. Fairness doctrine was maybe the smartest named legislation, but remember, the fairness doctrine was about a time when the physical spectrum was physically limited. And so you could have a fairness doctrine because the government gave people permission to be on the airwaves, so they could say, yeah, we need both points of view. I think it's unfortunately physically outdated, but the idea is something I would support. Sydney's question, I am wholeheartedly sympathetic. I wish I had done more. I would absolutely think the State Department should be open to working with organizations around racial equity. I know they have a lot of work to do internally, but that also doesn't mean they shouldn't do work externally. Again, I'm happy to talk to you guys. Public diplomacy is important. I think it's very important in this kind of struggle that we talked about authoritarian move towards authoritarianism away from democracy. obviously everybody who's on this call is on the right side of that, and harnessing and using diplomacy in that direction, I think, is the calling of our time. And you can do that in ways macro and micro. And I hope we did a little bit here today. So thank you for having me.
Thank
Carla.
you. Thank you so much. We did a lot, not a little, a lot. Please unmute and join me in thanking our amazing speaker. Richard, thank you so much, Mr. Stengel, for being with us. I'm gonna invite Sophie. I'm going to invite Sophie to put our last slide up as we say goodbye to Mr. Stengel. And I want to remind you all, this time next week, 10:30, we'll have our next session. We'll be actually welcoming the newly appointed Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the State Department. So some of the questions that were presented here might be very, very suited there. And as always, if you have any questions, my email is up. I think most of you have it. We'll send out the recording of today's session in the chat and the follow-up materials as well early next week. I'll stick around for a minute or two here if anyone wants to chat. But a big thank you also to Allison Hillegeist and to Sophie Araz for all of the help running the technical aspects here. I'm going to stop the recording and thank you once again.
Thank you.